Oh, wow. Okay. So we were live. Um, all right. Welcome to Offscript 3 for the audience. Today we have somebody very special who's been with us since quite the start, and that's Mihai. And Mihai has been a senior advisor for quite some time, almost 2 years. A little introduction about Mihai, and it's a very extensive background, and he's spent time at Nomura, at JPMorgan, and Barclays, so over a decade, maybe even more, about 15 years, I would say, or so in traditional finance, and then he's moved into the on-chain finance world, working with the likes of Obligate and Penomo and MetaWealth, and a lot in between. And so he brings a wealth of experience for us from on both the sides. And I would stop here. I'll pause here for now at the moment, and would just like to welcome you, Mihai, to the Offscript and to the audience, and maybe a small welcome note from your end. And my first question, which is something that you can go into directly, is what compelled you to go from traditional finance into on-chain finance? And I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Jazz, and yeah, great to be on Offscript for this first time, and obviously with an old friend now and business partner. That's you and the Penomo team. Just to answer that, it's twofold. I think one is more secular in seeing the evolution of the industry per se, from what has been fundamentally what I call a Bretton Woods financial system that we created post World War II. That's obviously grown and expanded, and you had various layers of innovation added to it, like the Big Bang of the 80s in England and what have you, and the various deregulations that happened subsequently in the US in the 90s. But ultimately, the industry itself and the layers through which money flows in the system has not changed. And that for me was one trigger. And as this industry sort of emerged in various forms and shapes from its early days, was very intellectually intriguing. And obviously now it's a very, very large ecosystem of standing around 4 trillion market cap even after the sell-off. So it is a belief that finance has grown as a result of globalization and economic growth, but has not grown as a result of innovation. And innovation ultimately has come to the doors of finance too, and that is ultimately a mixture of DeFi through blockchain technology, of course, and the overlay that AI has proven to be for the last 12 months or so, which has only, in my view, enhanced and buttressed the argument for blockchain and DeFi. It has not diminished it. And the second one is a personal one. I think when you spend more than a decade at JPMorgan and some of the other institutions you mentioned, you learn a lot, and you learn process, you learn institutional discipline, you learn you obviously interact with the global money allocators and money makers, participants. But I think building things in those setups is harder. I'm not saying it's impossible, because there's still innovation, but by the very nature, innovation is dragging a bit because of inertia. So I always wanted to hopefully bring that background into a context that goes from 0 to 1. And I think our industry, and specifically what Penomo does, is there.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I think you mentioned one word here, which is key. Just to continue this topic, and that is inertia. And I think our audience would love to understand what that inertia is and why does it exist, because innovation then finds it very hard to come into the picture and drive finance forward, and etc etc. So what would you say, why does that inertia exist?
I think because when things go well, and they do, I mean, you'll see when quarterly results of banks, and they feel very robust. And if I were to look at my former long-term employer, JP Morgan, look at the share price when I joined was 50, now it's 230, I think. I mean, net income per quarter is more than double in this period. So there's still revenue to be generated in the various layers. And when things go well, shaking up a very solid tree is a lot harder, right? I always say when you build like give you a parallel, like there's some blockchain that have not been built for institutional audience out there, and I think it's very hard to redo that. Like if something has been built for something with a purpose, to go back and redo the very foundation on which that was built, it's not happening. And it's also an opportunity cost analysis that you do as an institution, as an individual. Why change if things go well? And people tend to at times realize that too late. Having said that, all the banks have gradually entered this space, including Jamie Dimon's take on blockchain technology in the early days that was very dismissive, to today them being a very active payment, especially player, but also in the payment space. I meant
Yeah.
through the JPM coin and stable coins at large, which is clearly a one of the great successes of the industry, I would say, in terms of innovation, money flow, and what have you. So I think we all have it in our day-to-day life as well, inertia. The question is it the good or the bad one?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But yet, you would think, or one would think, JP Morgan being a massive, institution, it still has been very active in all the innovation areas, right? I mean, it has been very active in bringing up teams, addressing each innovation area. So they've been very actively involved with machine learning, AI, already a decade ago when it began. They started Onyx, which is the JPM coin initiative and everything that came onto that. They wanted to have their own blockchain ecosystem, and it has now evolved into something else under a different brand, but doing the same thing. But would you say there is a real shift from there's a real shift in among the institutions in the mindset that, okay, if now is the time to adopt blockchain technology, and they're seeing real value in tokenization, in stable coins, and so on, because we see action happening. JP Morgan was one of the first institutions to go onto it, but since BlackRock came very aggressively onto this, and then there were all the big banks who started doing this, and now it's trickling down in the capital market stack. Would you say this is a real shift, or do you think this is just very opportunistic, and if it doesn't work, it's gonna they're like, yeah, we can always go back to something which was always working?
I mean, I'll go sort of from your last question or last point, and then I'll address the bigger picture here. I think the luxury on the we talk about the downside of inertia, but on the flip side, they obviously have a very cash generating successful business that's very well oiled and plug and play, right? And they can afford to burn cash and deploy money a lot more so than innovative startups, because they've got that liquidity buffer, so they can play. Not it's not JP Morgan specific. I think you look at Visa and Mastercard and like PayPal and many other players who've entered this space and with their own relevance. Um, so I think they are still run, in my view, as very much separate tracks from what I saw when I was there and what I hear and seen. So there is almost like a shielded ecosystem of blockchain innovate innovation hub experts that are sort of looking across various verticals within the bank and where the industry can improve processes, cut costs, create revenue. And that is a good segue into why I think banks do it. And I think it's for two reasons. I don't I don't subscribe to the view that there's an existential threat to the industry. Uh, Maybe payments, but then they still control the money flow, and regulation is very important in this space. So when adoption of the big players is happening as it does in the cycle of crypto adoption, that's when real things get moved, right? Because that's where the real, cash supply in the system gets circulated and allocated accordingly. So I don't think it's an existential one. I think it's twofold. And I think one is overhead. How do you reduce costs? How do you improve processes, right? Like, how do you still need to have 17 intermediaries to issue a bond? Do you still need T+2 settlement? Do you still have to have delays? Do you still have to go through all those, Swift messages, cutoffs per currency? Oh, it's euro, oh, it's dollar. Call the agent, Bloomberg tickets, which, if you think about it, is pretty obsolete. I mean, the way it's done, is not 2022 user experience for sure. So there's that. And then obviously by doing so, you also improve the risk metrics, because the likelihood of a fat finger mistake and all of that disappears. Of course, machines can also be wrong. As we've learned, blockchains can be hacked. You have cybersecurity has become much more prevalent in our world, and we've seen it in our day-to-day life as well as in the financial sector. But I think ultimately it will improve. It will reduce costs. It will improve risk management and real-time data of your positions and your flows as an institution. And two is a new revenue opportunity, right? Can you make more money through it? And it's twofold, right? I was reading an article the other day in the FT about, well, obviously there've been quite a few IPOs this year that are crypto industry related, and there's a massive list of crypto businesses that have registered with the SEC for IPO and or direct issuance. And I that's a clear revenue opportunity for bank, right? One, through M&A advisory and fees that they're already making. Two, are you able to start trading these instruments, provide financing against it? I mean, there are discussions already in banks about how do you take a portfolio of, let's say, the top 5 crypto tokens out there, obviously Bitcoin, ETH, and some of the really highly market capped altcoins, and provide financing against it, help them, monetize that, create that, if you want, that composability in the system that we keep talking about in crypto.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's exciting, right? Because in an industry that's struggling with what I would call the unwind of globalization after so many years with, geopolitics and all that, when capital is frictioned, the flows between countries are not as easy as they used to be, having borderless technology becomes very appealing, including for banks. Even though you could argue transparency is not good because it reduces margins. But if it improves other aspects of the flow, it can still be net positive.
Yeah, I mean that's. I have so many points and questions here, but I think I want to cover those a little bit later. But before we dive deeper into those topics, I want the audience to understand what exactly you did at JP Morgan, for over a decade. Because when somebody reads you led alternative credit and development finance institution syndicates, like I think many people don't understand what DFIs are in the first place. You've already obviously spent enough time with infrastructure finance, which is obviously why it made a lot of sense for us to do things together. Can you describe a little bit more into your time at JPM, how it started and how you ended it, and what was your day to day, and what was the bigger picture there?
For sure, yeah. To put it in very simple terms, and I've evolved, like, well, we all evolve in life, hopefully, and my career has
Yeah.
evolved too. So I started in an institutional sales function at JP, covering emerging markets clients across asset classes, so from credit to foreign exchange, interest rates, financing, so all the product spectrum that a bank has to offer. And then sort of the latter part, the last 5-6 years of my career at JP, I focused on what was at the time an emerging asset class called private credit, alternative credit, or what have you. I think private credit is what people have settled on in the end.
Yeah.
And within that, my role ultimately, as the and it's natural as the asset class got more defined, the individual roles got more defined because we knew where you sit in that life cycle of a transaction. And what a syndicate function does, it works very closely with the origination. So you have an individual who originates a transaction, and that's normally they talk to a borrower that has a need to finance a project, to refinance an asset, to acquire a new asset, to improve their cost of balance sheet, to raise more capital, more senior, more junior, what have you. So it's across the capital structure. And then you put a structure in place, and then the origination team would come to syndicate, which sits in the trading business, to underwrite that trade and say, well, if we bring that trade to the market, are there investors who buy that risk? And you have to work very closely on all the terms of the transactions, both economic terms and risk adjusted terms in terms of downside protection and all of that, to have a transaction that's bankable, that's ultimately has an exit into the market, because
Yeah.
there are, especially for American banks, there are a lot of regulations around um, it's called actual REND analysis, which basically means you need to run an analysis that we cannot hold positions on your balance sheet for more than 180 days post origination. So if you underwrite it, you need to have a fairly clear exit strategy of where that goes. So that was my day to day, and I would talk to investors who would look to allocate into such transactions. And the driver for that is because either the capital was solely private credit focused, or illiquid credit, whatever you want to call it, or two, because they were looking for alpha generation on the top of the liquid market. All right, because if the
Yeah.
liquid market gets priced at here, my transaction would get priced here because of complexity, illiquidity, and all of the above. Um, so that's sort of one aspect of it. And then as that evolved, and I focus primarily on emerging markets, clearly a big theme in emerging market is just still the financing gap, right? Like
Yeah.
how do you have the the north and the south merge in terms of the capital flow and all that, and how do you finance it better? How do you make ultimately emerging markets that are shallow in terms of their capital penetration, high risk in terms of being high yield, and sometimes in the triple C to the almost default scenario, still bankable? And on the back of that, we had a working group with the IFC, which is a arm of financing of the World Bank Group, to look at building in-house what we coined as a development finance institution, which was an entity that sat in the broader public sector coverage group of the bank globally, um, and focused solely on working with global emerging markets desk to qualify transactions that a bank would originate in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and by doing so to create a qualification framework of development finance for those transactions. I.e., I'm a issuer, I issue a bond. The use of proceeds of that financing of that bond, and it can be a loan too, it can be any other instrument, it doesn't have to be a bond, need to match certain criteria, and they need to have subsequent reporting, so such that they they are scored, right? There's a score from 0 to 5. Obviously,
Yeah.
the more you're willing to report, the more aligned with the UN Sustainable Development, UN SDGs it was.
SDGs. Yeah.
Yeah, the SDGs, the higher the score. And concretely, what that did, because it's always nice to put ribbons on boxes, as I say, but and there's nothing wrong
Always.
with that. But I think what that did, it crowded in capital that otherwise would have not looked at the asset class because of
Yeah.
its clear sustainability angle. And I know in a world when sustainability or ESG, for good or bad reasons, it's been challenged, because I think there's been a lot of, like everything that happens too quickly, it's been a lot of bad media, but I think fundamentally the direction of travel remains. And in that respect, I see investors still do what they want to do. They want to double down on it insofar that they want to make it more robust, clearer, so that they can allocate capital better and without, a doubt that there's an active greenwashing, quite frankly, or any such. And I think having and now JP Morgan, and last time, and that was a few years back, it's a very elaborate discussion with the other group of banks around creating a qualification with ICMA, which is the International Capital Markets Association, for development finance. So I think for me, it was a very nice Venn diagram overlap between my, I would call my day-to-day job and something that I was always very passionate about. And it's like, how do you crowd in private capital into emerging markets? And how do you do that, especially in those markets that, because, emerging markets is still a very, very broad church, right? You have
Yeah.
single A's, like, you have Mexico and Middle East and Israel, who obviously are very bankable. And then you have West and East Africa, you have parts of the Southeast Asia that, like, they struggle, right, for a variety of reasons. And then it's like, how do you bring money, away from the sovereign that needs to finance its budget deficit for infrastructure projects, for roads, we looked at a project in Northern Africa in a bond format for women inclusion. We, looked at strategic road financings in one of the West African countries. Um, it's certain communities that would not have access otherwise to connect amongst each other. So those roads were key to take kids to school, parents to work, anyone to hospitals if needed. So, like all these things that are so important now day to day. And as we, live in the cities we do, we don't necessarily think it through that way. But yeah, I mean, I know it's a bit of a long and convoluted answer, but ultimately that's what it was, just sort of marrying the borrower with a seller and creating the best possible structure that they both, is finding that point of sale, where does the bid and offer meet, or they do rather.
Yeah, I mean, you would say this is a long answer, right? But you're basically compressing 10 years, 11 years of work into, a few minutes. So it's still a very, very short answer. But that's fascinating, right? So, I mean, I think the way I look at it is it was a very high impact role, right? Because we both have spoken of this, a lot, that emerging markets are where private capital needs to flow, or any capital in general has to flow, especially when it comes to energy access, infrastructure, and so on. But what I've always tried to understand, and this has been key talking point also of building bridges in Geneva at at most big conventions, is how do you counter the risks that come in emerging markets, because you have FX, right, and then you have the political instabilities in so many jurisdictions. And then there's also the concern of having boots on the ground and see, it's not just about bankability at that point, it's about who is tracking it, like building that local trust network that okay, things are real. And then getting the governments alone or sovereign wealths alone or all of these kind of world aids alone cannot sustainably finance the gap. And so you need private capital. But the moment you go to a private capital allocator, they are like, okay, sounds good, how do we address the risk, and the yields are not that great in emerging markets. So how would you say that that will be addressed in the coming I mean, this can go into tokenization and DeFi access and blah blah blah, liquidity. But what's your take on these 2 points, risk and yields in such markets?
So EM always had. I'll start with an anecdote I was told by a legend in this space and a former mentor and colleague of mine at JP, who said the emerging market has become an enormous asset class with the smallest of exit doors you can imagine. And in general, when the market is risk on, when the interest rates are lower and all that, people do tend to, you see larger inflows into EM because obviously on a relative value basis, they become a lot more attractive. than investing in UK gilts or treasuries or what have you. But so I think there's that point. The question is, how do you price risk? And so a lot of these risks, and what a structuring team does, they try to mitigate as much as possible of these risks. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, and that's why very often you'll have documentation on the English law, because if things go wrong, you got to be able to enforce collateral or take the borrower, in a case of event of default, to courts under English law jurisdiction. Ultimately, if the assets sit in I don't know, Nigeria, Kenya, or Guatemala, you still have to enforce them locally. So you'll never fully alleviate that risk. So I don't think its question is, how do you price it and how do you create the best downside protection you can. On FX, so most of the emerging markets I dealt with, they have a liquid enough FX market that you can hedge that risk through swaps, through FX swaps, so that there is an option of that sort. There are also
Yeah.
certain frontier markets that that's not the case, and you see players from the multilateral institutions, so including the DFC, so that's the Development Finance Corporation of the U.S. government, so the formerly known as OPIC. You have
Mm.
Guaranco, who we know
Yeah.
very well, part of PIDG.
Yeah. Did you?
They provide guarantees, especially for that. You see, BII, which is the Development Bank of the UK, where they provide that sort of protection for local currency risk for investors to be able to come and deploy. Because obviously, if you're a borrower and you end up with a dollar loan and you raise money in I don't know, let's say South African rand, and then you still have to pay dollar, but the rand depreciated 50%. You're not going to pay that loan back. I mean, that's the reality of it. And the question is, it's bad for the borrower, it's bad for the investor, because neither of them get what they want. So
Yeah.
I think yields. I think it's an issue of it's an issue of relative value, of where everything else gets priced. It's also issue of supply. So you have had periods in the last 2 years where you had a lot more redemptions than issuance. So supply has been negative, net. And as a result, obviously, you still have a lot of EM dedicated funds that need to deploy capital. So that can sometimes create a bit of a price squeeze, but this tends to be temporary. Also, when you see, and you made a very good comment, which is very, well, you say it's unique to EM, but we see a lot more in DM these days, which is
Yeah.
political risk.
Correct.
Um,
Well, it's a
used to be a
different.
EM story, but it's become a lot more of a DM story. I mean,
Yeah.
I can mention my current residence, which is Paris, and
Well,
we've
we
struggled
get that.
for a for a while. Yeah, the many others, including the other side of the pond, indeed,
Yeah.
with a government shutdown and what have you. But EM obviously it has got. I think it's got a less comprehensible and less measurable EM risk, right? Because
Yeah.
you have um, now again, it goes into the sovereign rating, and then the way you'd price everything, you'd start by looking at the sovereign curve and where that trades, and everything you do on the back of that has a premium. Be that because most of the issuances, unless you do a securitization of some sort, most of the issuances would have a ceiling in terms of rating or in terms of spread to the sovereign.
Yeah.
Now you can have deals whereby you do a securitization on receivables that are export driven, or diversified payment rights, i.e. remittances, whereby the risk you securitize is not linked to the macro picture of the country in which the risk lies, and it's securitized. So because of that, you can have a rating uplift versus where the sovereign is. And a good example of that is Turkey. Turkey has been a high yield for many years now, because of geopolitics. And on the top of that, it had um, these programs whereby they would bring the issuances into the investment grade territory because of
Interesting.
securitization and remittances. So there are ways to, as I said, mitigate risk, get good risk from certain countries, but and it's really a function of each and individual mandate of the investors, right, and where that lies. So I think for me that's ultimately
Yeah. I
where
mean.
I put that. I
Yeah.
mean,
I mean
EMS had
that's.
an exceptional year this year, but it also had a terrible year 2 years ago. And there's also two
Yeah.
things: there's EM credit and EM local. EM credit is basically the credit spread in dollar terms, and local is where you take the FX component, which you very correctly mentioned, and very often EM local tends to trade worse historically because of the volatility of currencies. Especially in the higher rates environments, people tend to go to safe haven, which used to be and still is the US dollar. So that creates a sell-off on the other side of the EM currencies. And because central banks in those countries don't have enough reserves at times to control that flow, and they're very reliable on, current account balance, deficit, and they're, very reliant on inflows from abroad. Whenever that sort of a risk-off mood gets turned on, you see FX depreciating massively.
Yeah. I mean, that's. I think you've covered all of the important points, right? I mean, yes, there are solutions for hedging FX risk. Like, we've spoken with TCX, and they have a very nice product, and they have that capital pool which can help you hedge the risk and provide a fixed FX rate throughout the financing duration. You have all those things. Political risk are hard to judge. But somehow I've seen, for example, Brazil, right? We met the Brazilian, very senior government official, and we spoke to two GIZ. So there are companies out there. Where I'm getting at is there's a lot of players in between. In put simply, the buyer and the seller. There's a lot of people in between which need to exist in order to make huge amounts of infrastructure financing possible in
Yeah.
emerging markets. And the cost of financing goes very high in these areas, and that's something, anything that helps to bring it down, is very much sought after at the moment. When we speak of CredOS, we'll get to that in a second. But one point I want to talk about is, what do you think is going to compel private capital allocators, right? We're talking about the investors which have not typically invested in such an asset class. Let's say DMEM doesn't really matter. What do you think compels them to come into such an asset class? Let's since we're talking about emerging markets, and say, like, okay, now I would allocate. What do you think is that compelling reason is? Is it that impact? Is it like, okay, sounds good, it addresses the SDG goals XYZ, and we have these benefits at home, tax reductions, whatever? Or is it are we seeing a surge of more bankable projects, better yields? What do you think is the top two compelling reasons for private allocators to come into this space?
Um, I think uh, I don't really think it's any. I think it's opportunity set and pricing, right? Like you need to look. Of course, some funds have specific mandates and they've raised money for that. I mean, if you're a
Yeah,
development bank or if you're a development agency, like I don't know, an FMO, Proparco,
FMO. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And sorry, apologies for
no, it's okay.
that. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, so if you're FMO and Proparco, any of these that uh, let me sorry, Uncle. That's this is when you have too many channels happening at the same
Just
time.
is somebody's disturbing the. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, we're looking at the.
Oh, we have some questions.
I thought maybe we do have questions, but let's see if that comes out between. Uh,
But
yeah, I mean, you can continue, and then we'll
yeah,
we'll
I
address the
suppose so.
questions
Yeah,
in between.
basically,
Yeah, yeah,
yes. Um, so I think that is the mandate you have, right? Then you raise money for that. So you look at the opportunity set across the spectrum and where that sits. But ultimately it's a pricey thing. I've always been of the view that even when I was having discussions, constructive debates, I would say with the development finance team at JP, people, they have investors have a fiduciary duty to make money for their LPs. So
yeah,
like the idea that they should just buy Ghanaian bonds cheaper than US treasuries because they want to see that country growing is not. That's called a grant. That's not called a loan, and that's not called investment. And there are grants for that, and that's a different product. But when it comes to lending and infrastructure and capital markets, pricing drives everything. in my view, and obviously structure on the back of that, which is the opportunity set. So I see those two combined drive the latter
Got it.
pretty much. So that would be my ultimate take on it. So I don't think you'll ever see. I mean, you've had situations in which you'd have a what they call a greenium, a premium for being green, and that happened primarily in developed markets and not in EM, from what I'm aware. And the reason for that was, again, because people raised a lot of money for green funds. The supply side was not large enough, so they were basically there's more demand than supply at some point, and then people were willing
Yeah.
to pay more for what was ultimately the same risk. You just had a green label. You had a leaf on
Yeah.
Bloomberg, as they say. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then the greeniums, greeniums. Sorry, what is it? Whatever it was called. But that led to a lot of greenwashing as well, because a lot of carbon credit projects came in, which were not really backed by tangible projects, which were measurable, and so on and so forth. We know the rest
Yeah, of course.
of the
Well,
of the story.
TWS and a few other stories we don't need to. Yeah, but exactly. You know very well.
Exactly.
Uh,
But
yeah,
then,
well, it's all public, and I'm sure everyone learns from their own mistakes. So it's not something to. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so what we've seen so far is, you did mention investors and LPs. I mean, these terms are used interchangeably. Also, sometimes, when some people prefer like investment. When you talk of investors, there are the LPs, and then GPs are the ones who are, managing the funds and deploying it. But I've seen, all the time I've spent with family offices, wealth managers, mid-market funds who want exposure to a new asset class, which is rather resilient and more predictable. And I think it was said somewhere recently that, predictability and reliability has a nice premium today as well in these, very uncertain markets. Energy infrastructure is very resilient. It's rather very predictable. It's very measurable, and it fits very well under the impact scope of, of investments. Any thoughts you had on this side before we go on to the juicier parts of AI and tokenization?
Yes, I think with energy infrastructure, it's normally driven by a different mindset of LPs, people who have what I call patient long-term capital,
Yeah.
and also allocators who originate and drive sort of the investable nature of it that way. I mean, the best example that's obviously an incredibly successful one. I have friends working there for its GIP that was bought by BlackRock, right?
BlackRock.
And
Yeah.
GIP was very clearly focused on that, and that's a very good, and I think that will be a good segue into just the last part of our conversation around AI and blockchain. It's like specialization and what's
Yeah.
your USP, what's your edge, and why are you doing this and what for, and why should we trust you? And they're very clear about that. And their edge was, we're only doing infrastructure. This is what we are all about. And um, uh, in that space, I I still think it's only a big boys game in terms of size, in terms of barriers of entry. You cannot just take a view that want to invest in a battery energy storage. And, and we can talk obviously about my other engagement with MetaWealth and all that in line with what Penomo is doing. But um, you can't really, if I want to invest in a wind farm as an individual, if I want to invest in, this is not how it works. You're basically a price taker, you're a consumer. It's a very, very, um, it's an asset class that it's been almost designed for private credit, and it's set there and needs. I think there are a few things. It's the access to it, right? How do you access it as an investor? And it's, as I said, its barriers of entry are quite high in terms of sophistication, investable amount, duration, etc., etc. But also, if I'm a portfolio manager, managing the risk of that asset throughout its lifetime is not, it's always what I would call, it's got a time lag. It's very it's a bit like rating agencies, and I've always had an issue with that. They react, they not proact, right?
Yeah.
You don't observe things that happen in the ecosystem. like corporate actions, extensions, breach of covenants, any sort of events that can happen to a project, they are delivered to you, ex post, not a priori. As a result, one would argue in extremis that you're not managing your asset well, right? Because you should prevent those, you should not. And now, obviously, you should structure the deal in such a way that ending up in that situation should still give you enough downside protection. But what I think for assets like that, creating a sense where payment flows are a lot more automated through smart contracts. Um, they're very transparent, especially throughout, because remember, infrastructure is about building things, it's about timelines and milestones. So having those milestones and having clear inputs into the smart contract that releases cash on chain based on completion of milestones rather than avoiding acts of corruption, or
Yeah.
money sifting away out of the system, and then monitoring that access through an AI machine learning engine that looks at the ecosystem, looks at the borrower, looks at movements in the market that you wouldn't necessarily have the time, the energy to observe, and blends them together and can give you, amber, red, green signals on your asset in the portfolio that, you should maybe check in with them before they check in with you that they've got a problem. I think those things are for me fundamental, and it, it's only going to get bigger. I think it's a very inefficient way of allocating capital today, but it is being allocated because it's tangible, is required, and people need it. So yeah, very much. I think I think I answered your question, but
Yeah. No, you did. You did. No, you did, and you mentioned quite a few important points in here as well. So I think exactly it's a very inefficient way of allocating capital in here. It has traditionally not been easy for anybody except the big boys to enter this space, and now we are seeing more and more efforts where like tokenization helps lower the barrier a lot. But then what people don't understand is these things, for every project you're investing in at every stage, development projects have a different risk, operating assets have a different risk, and then that's and you have to be very particular on you have to understand what you're investing in. If it's an operating asset, if you're just investing, in my opinion, as in the retail markets, if you're just investing just to get the yields back, it might work well for you, but then it's a very expensive business to originate these the transaction. It's not good for the it's very sustainable for the business who's doing that. So doing that standalone is very complicated, and retail. But if you're getting actual utility back, I think that's where I am also very personally bullish on that. It's not
great.
just the it's not just the financial returns. If you can actually get actual utility out of these assets, then it's very interesting. But to get the system moving, you gotta tap into the flow where capital is already moving, and then you channel part of it into this, and then build it on top of it. And I think that's what you mentioned, using smart contracts, and by how can you make the payment system much smarter. You don't need many intermediaries. How can you attract a new segment of private capital which previously didn't have access to this before? The mid market is pretty significant in terms of volume, in terms of numbers of allocators. Mid market dominates, right? Yeah, there is a concentration of capital among the some of the big guys. But I think one point, there's one key which the two of us have also discussed a lot, is the cost of operating a fund or
Yeah,
any asset management operation is going very high, and that's talk of the town. How do we reduce the cost? And I think the deployment of AI in that first, so not just financing AI infrastructure, which is very energy heavy, which is also what we
yeah,
are related to, but also deploying AI itself in order to make the operations and the workflow of allocating private credit into this smoother and more efficient, and to cut down the costs. And it was just announced yesterday that OpenAI, I shared it in the chat with you as well. The OpenAI is hiring, I think, hundreds of investment bankers
I saw,
to
yeah,
make
it's
them
all over the
to
front page of EFT today, actually.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's on FT, it's on Bloomberg. So and we know OpenAI is rather desperate to show the actual use case of AI on large scale corporate use case. And so they pick finance as the first case, and it's going to creep in. So everybody and they're doing this because they know the people in the financial markets, especially the allocators, are looking to reduce the costs of operations because it's killing them slowly to get the yields that they've promised their LPs, and that's where CredOS comes in. So I love your take on why deploying AI in the process of allocating capital and reducing the or increasing the efficiency has a big impact in the space.
I mean, I'll say it's as simple as saying it's ultimately going back to the ultimate, to the reason why we are doing why we're doing, right? Why I've joined finance many years ago, even it was, quite frankly, it is probably the lowest, as the bottom of its moral appreciation or depreciation rather, the financial crisis, and I was for a few, Nomura and all of those early days post financial crisis, and I've always believed in the force of good of finance and what it does. And it goes back to how we started the conversation, how we've built more, we've created financial products, we've done CLOs, we've done the CDSs, we've done swaps, we've had a big bank. Have we actually made capital more accessible? Have we actually created the most optimal and most perfect velocity of money in the system? From it was how do you make counterparty risk less risky, and how do you make an investment more investable? And my answer is twofold. By reducing the counterparty risk, you create atomic settlements and real-time monitoring, and that's what blockchain does. And you make the less investable by automating underwriting and flows that are so overhead expensive and heavy today, and deploying AI. And by doing so, you create two things. You create, I think, a more profitable financial market for the sector itself, because you're going to have, in my view, less defaults, less workouts on your credit, more deployment of capital. If you're a medium-sized credit fund, you'd be able to compete a lot better with the big guys, because you'd have got rid of that sort of overhead burden that you could not maybe afford otherwise. Um, and on the other side, if you are an emerging markets borrower, and a lot of the risk comes from settlements, comes from process, comes from timelines, and what I would call agency. And I think what AI ultimately does, with one caveat, which I'll add at the end, what AI does, it removes agency risk. It removes that risk that the information that's given to you, and that's particularly prevalent in emerging markets, which is an area that I've specialized in, um, by providing with information that's very very accurate and very uh, you know it's you have the LLMs, and that train you, that are third party enabled, that do not overlap with what's in the ecosystem. Now, obviously, for all of that to work, you've got to have the right inputs, because the problem with, and there are many examples out there which we've all read about, the machine learns based on information that's been provided with, and it learns very fast and very effectively. But the sine qua non, the fundamentals, condition, um, prima facie, that model needs to have its correct data at inception,
Correct.
and then it
Yeah.
can. And I think that is the ultimate problem that I think the society at large, the developers, the governments, of course, have a duty to solve. not by controlling it, but by enabling it. Because obviously having a contaminated data at inception creates a multiple contamination, and it makes a monster out of it. And we've seen a few cases of that in the world today. So, and this is where I think there's still the adoption is happening, and particularly from my perspective, AI's adoption is a lot faster than I would have envisaged it to be. Uh, I mean, we use it for work, we use it for personal life, we use it for everything. Uh, I also am, and it's obviously have now the AI agent functions, and you have all these other modular features, but it's also how you train them. And I do think I'm of the belief that it's the question you ask that creates the result you want in those models. So I think human capital and intelligence and social skills and all of that will still prevail. I don't believe in a world that I will. Of course, certain jobs will disappear, but they have in many generations. But new ones will be
Yeah,
created, and they'll be created for the better good. And I think for finance in particular, having AI will get will get rid of a lot of inefficiencies, and obviously cost is one, but it's also. I was speaking to a CFO a few months back, and he said, who's very, very bullish on blockchain adoption and of AI modeling and all that. So as a CFO of any, and it can be the CFO of Apple or the CFO of JPMorgan or the CFO of Penomo. Hopefully, we'll have one soon. But uh, you don't have real time balance sheet data. It's always a day or two delays. There's always, because you need to do reconciliations. You have Excels, you have tables. There's no way, because money is not sadly automatic, and you have money that you know sits around, and you have these swift messages that get sent over, and sometimes they break, and you have money that's just end up in the wrong account, and it's quite extraordinary. I mean, if you look at all the payment solutions that have been out there, you look at Stripe, you look at Venmo in the US, what they've done incredibly smoother front end user experience,
correct. Yeah,
but the back end is a disaster still, in my view. At the back end, they have to deal with the same issues. They have to deal with delays. They have 3-day delays to get settlements. So they actually get credit lines and warehousing facilities, because you get paid straight away if you Venmo me and you, but the
yeah,
Venmo itself doesn't get paid straight away from your bank to my bank.
exactly, exactly.
And that's a retail issue that exists in infrastructure, in private credit, in banking, in every other aspect, because ultimately finance has layers, but the very principle of it remains the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to go to the Q and A, but to sum it up, I think the value. I think very few people understand. I mean, the ones who are in the space, like you and me, we understand that, but the value of bringing transparency to this in real time monitoring, is very high, because especially in asset financing, right? It's
Yeah.
it's like people don't also there's so much value for it, post debt, right? Post debt monitoring is, if you do, if you understand the risk of an asset post credit in the post debt phase, you can be very proactive about, okay, should you be exiting the asset right now, or do you need to double down more into it, and so on and so forth. Do not go deep into it. But I think vertical specific AI systems, rather than a specific LLM, is what really is going to drive this industry forward, and this is what is the need of the hour. I mean, we've seen that with the companies, we've mentioned in between, and the others that but I mean, we could go on for a very long time, and as I mentioned
Indeed,
before, the
indeed.
1 hour is just going to fly by. Let's have a look at the questions that we have from the audience, because I know we do have some. The first one is that a question, or is that success often depends on your network? Do you believe that your experience and the relationships you've established could open doors for Penomo that might not have been accessible otherwise? Well, I have an answer to this, but maybe Mihai, you can go.
Well, I'll go. Like, I think it does. I mean, ultimately, we are humans, and I think it goes back to my last point. I believe we'll prevail. I know people get very scared of machines and all that, and I think the relationship you build and the trust you build fosters more trust. And while obviously introducing a new business, and that can be Penomo or any other, like a business that you believe in, it requires a lot more of a narrative effort than introducing JPMorgan has been around for 300 years and 250.
Yeah.
But it's still, it comes with a qualification of trust, right? I know what I'm talking about, and it's the reason why I'm backing this institution. Of course, you need to have context and content and deliver that to investors. But I think it does, yes, for sure. Um, and also knowledge, right? I think life teaches you a lot, and that's one of the greatest things of going through life. You become more knowledgeable, hopefully, and you are able to differentiate between good, bad, legit, illegit, and all of the above. So yes, the answer is yes to that question.
Awesome. I think so. Yeah, this one is okay. There's another one also from Francesco. With Do you want to read it yourself, or I think you can read it yourself?
I can do, yeah. It says, with
Maybe
such an
that
impressive
could be easier.
background, thank you. What inspired you to actively join something still growing, especially when you're already been part of major institutions like JPMorgan and Barclays? I think I alluded to that, Francesco, the inception of the Offscript session, and it comes to the point. It's like, do you want to leave something behind? Do you want to build something? You learn a lot, and you have, it's almost like going to, it's like going to Harvard or Cambridge or any university, and then what do you do with that afterwards? In the professional world, I call these institutions that, but ultimately, as Steve Jobs said, you've got to trust your gut and connect the dots looking backwards, not forwards, because that's how they connect. So that's what inspired me, really. The idea that looking backward, the dots would have connected and something a lot greater would have come out of it.
Interesting. I have one question on this, right? So, what is if there was one thing you would hope the big guys, right, like the JP Morgans, take from the younger nimble guys like us, what would that be? And the second thing is, what would you see the younger and the nimble guys adopt from somebody as big as JPM?
I think the bigger guys always look at companies like ourselves and a few others in the ecosystems, like for relevance. So you've got a proof of concept, you've got a addressable market, you've got adoption, you've scaled it up, and then very often they either want to partner up or have an equity strategic stake in them, like because they are aware deep down that that inertia we talked about is there, and they know we can move a lot faster to innovate than them because they have hurdles process to go through. So they're aware of that, and that's why they buy companies and they invest in projects
Yeah,
and they do
yeah,
things through various parts. I think that's what they do. They would look at it and say, well, and obviously then they might like the story and say, okay, well, what are the synergies with what we're trying to achieve? Where does that fit in our strategy, in our divisions, in our focus areas? And from this side of the table, I think what you learn, and I see that, I think what innovation has, and I call it, it's they call it creative destruction, right? Was it Schumpeter? I think he said that it has the vision, it has the ambition, it has the boldness. It's like, you talk on 2049, and the meaning of 2049. People ask me, what is that in crypto? And it has that vision that very rarely you see in your average banker or lawyer or corporate person in the city of London or Manhattan. Why it does lack very often, and I think what one should learn from that is focus on delivering and narrowing down and focus on delivery of what that USP is till you get it right. And two is discipline and process, but again without overdoing it, because as you know, big institutions can overdo the latter.
yeah.
Uh,
I mean, they often
I,
do. Yeah.
yeah, but I think on the other side, startups can lack fully that, and that
Hmm.
makes, I think that and luck and context and circumstance, of course, but that makes and breaks the story. And it's always a
Yeah,
survival bias. You hear about the success stories, but you don't hear about the ones that don't succeed. So I
yeah,
think product focus, USP, delivery, and discipline and process delivering the above is what banks would be very well suited to teach startups.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's well said. And I know we are over time, but I wanted to ask one last question, which is totally off topic. What is one person, one thing, one item, anything that keeps you awake at night? Could be anything. Now this can be an any answer, really.
I think like all of us,
We are
our
live,
our
Mihai. We are live. Just keep that in mind.
our iPhones, I guess, and I guess that trickles down to uh, the person is Steve Jobs, who's been my inspiration for many years now in his speech of 2005. But it's all in one, and it's there. No, what keeps me awake? Not a lot, because I'm a positive, and I always think a glass is half full. So it keeps me awake in the sense of trying to build and trying to deliver as an individual. But I think the world is not as bad as we read in the news and we tend to think. And I think we have too much access to too quick of an information flow. I think we should have access to information. I'm always in favor of transparency and all that. But I think our consumption of information is very skewed and is not necessarily very, very well thought through. So that would be my take on it. So yeah, I think, but like I guess a lot of other people, my iPhone keeps me pretty busy.
That was a good one. Now, this was wonderful, Mihai. Thanks a lot for the entire 1 hour and everything else. I think we have a lot to talk about for 10 more off scripts, but I think we'll cut this one off here and probably plan another one at a different point. I'd say, yeah, enjoy the time, where you are right now, and we're probably going to see each other soon, unless you have a ending note for the audience or somebody in general, which you'd already given. I think we're good to call it this one
I
off.
think the notice which I see a lot in this ecosystem, and I don't know, obviously the audience I'm sure is very varied, is keep building, don't settle, and think of everyone as a partner, not as a competitor. There's a lot more. Let's make that pie large, and then we can slice it and dice it. Yeah, but that's the advice that I give to everyone in life.
Wonderful. By the way, one of our ambassadors is saying where you are right now looks like a very beautiful place. Like, yeah, that's true. It is a beautiful place where you are right now. The location, I mean, the background. No, but cool.
That's how to do with fake walls sometimes. I can have a different one next time. I'm joking. But look, it's great to
This is no,
it's great to chat, and yeah, we'll
yeah,
we'll reconnect at the next stage, and hopefully we'll have a lot more to talk about
yeah.
how far we've gone and what we've achieved.
Sounds good. Brilliant. Speak to you soon, Mihai, and have a good one. And thanks, guys. Thanks for listening in.
Likewise.
And see you guys later.